Hey everybody, this is Mr. Baker again. This is Baker's Corner. This is our second lesson of two, where we will focus our attention on the after effects of the Civil War. And guys, just to recap a little bit of where we left off last time, we were talking about this transition from the Civil War to Reconstruction. And just one thing to keep in mind, you've got a variety of different perspectives on how to do that. You've got the presidential plans of people, especially like Lincoln, and then also Andrew Johnson, that advocate for a bit more of what might be described as lenient, quick kinds of reentry. And then you've got the radical Reconstruction plan that's focused a lot on things like more kind of like hoops to jump through as far as like newer amendments, extending voting rights, the idea, guys, of full citizenship through the idea of transitioning African Americans to really true equality with freedom and certainly rights and things. Okay, and so where we left off last time is I asked you all to maybe reflect on just your thoughts on Frederick Douglass. Now, keep in mind a little bit of context with Frederick Douglass. He's a figure that, of course, rose out of the institution of slavery. He became an abolitionist, of course. He went on to be a very strong advocate of African American participation in the Civil War, both before and also after the famous Emancipation Proclamation. And he's also going to really emphasize, guys, a lot of things along the lines of perspectives on how to move the country forward. But I think it's interesting, guys, if we look at what he says, the question I would pose to the students is, how do you look at maybe his perspective on this? Is he looking at the way that we're transitioning, guys, from the Civil War to Reconstruction as the glass is half full, the glass is half empty? What does he mean, for example, here where he says slavery has been called a great many names and it will continue to be in what a new skin this old snake will come forth next? What does he mean by that? Okay. And guys, if you're in my classes, especially the honors group, you have, I think, reflected on this individually and then also saw what some of your peers have written. The question is, guys, that I think is interesting is, do you think that Frederick Douglass would believe or did believe that fighting a war to overcome the institution of slavery was the best way to kind of move the country toward maybe an attitude of equality? Now, a couple of things that we need to keep in the back of or the front of our mind. And first and foremost is, guys, we need to understand that while there is going to be, a lot of change taking place in the southern states, especially the ones that allowed slavery as a result of the 13th Amendment to abolish it, the one thing that we have to keep in mind is that the 14th and 15th Amendments are also going to apply to every other state outside of the South as well, right? So when you're looking at defining citizenship, right, you could say, well, technically, is that a bit more geared toward some of the things that we saw with the famous Dred Scott case that was seen as a victory for a lot of southern states? And I would argue that, yeah, there's a lot of truth to that. Because the idea of voting, last time I checked, also, you got to be a citizen to vote. So therefore, the 15th Amendment with the voting rights is going to be something that really is important. Okay, so just something to kind of ponder. I would say that if you read Frederick Douglass closely, remember he lived about 30 years after the Civil War. Okay, until the year before the famous Plessy versus Ferguson case, and we will talk a little bit about that here toward the end when we lay a little bit more groundwork with the idea of segregation and legalized segregation particularly. But the one thing, guys, to keep in the back of your mind is that you're looking at a person, in my mind here, that doesn't probably have the confidence in a way that, perhaps fighting a war to end slavery was going to yield maybe the best course or results, right? So in other words, we know that there's going to be attitudes that continue to affect like the way that people think about equality, etc. Okay. The other thing to keep in mind is that you got to remember, while a lot of the Northern attitudes were supportive of the Civil War, not all of them, but certainly a lot of them, the one thing to keep in mind is that the presence of racism is by no means just limited to one region. You're going to see that, right? Job competition, that takes place when you start to see more African American movements. You see that also to an extent later on when you look at like the first what they call the Great Migration during World War One, and then also the other Great Migration during World War II, where you have a lot of relocation of African Americans. Okay. And so the conditions, you got to remember, socially, politically, and also economically, are going to be pretty significant with this. Now, with that being said, okay, we need to understand this might be a good place for you to pause your screen and maybe take a few things down. Guys, we looked at this a little bit when we looked at the Civil War, but when we're kind of looking at the effects of a time period, or even like the causes that lead to the effects, I think personally it's a little bit easier in my mind to connect them categorically. So we're going to look at economic, social, and political. Now, one thing for us to keep in the back of our minds, or maybe even the front of our minds, guys, is that there is some potential overlap here. Now, what I mean by that is you're looking at an economic effect that could also have social implications or even be a result of political things that are happening. Okay. So, for example, when you're looking at the institution of slavery coming to an end with the 13th Amendment, you got to remember, okay, there's a sizable portion of the population of the former Confederate states that are very reliant or have been very reliant on the idea of farming, right? Particularly cotton. And so there's going to be quite a bit of pressure to industrialize. Okay. And so what we notice is that in order to do this, guys, to be able to have more factories, you're going to have to be committed to the idea of some change, right? In other words, not just putting, your economic activity really into agricultural. And let's face the facts. What's the more common cash crop that you would have seen back then in most or many southern states? And cotton is definitely there, right? And we still see that today, a pretty important product, or shall we say crop, okay? And so when you have a loss of slave labor, and there's emphasis on still continuing, guys, the process of producing cotton, then the question is, where are you going to get your labor source from? Okay. And for a lot of people, the answer to this is going to be, maybe some white population that returned from the war. But for a lot of people, it's going to be actually a lot of the freedmen, right? So, a lot of them, they're used to farming. And there's two kinds of labor systems, sharecropping and tenant farming. Now, let me show you really quick, and I'll come back to that in just a second. Okay, but this kind of shows you guys, if you look at my map here, I want y'all guys to take a moment just to kind of look at it and process it. I don't know if you necessarily have to memorize all the specific, data, but definitely be able to understand what are we seeing with a trend with sharecropping. Okay. And the answer is, for the most part, we're seeing it in former Confederate states, right? So we're seeing it from Virginia, very little of it in Florida, but as you notice, guys, it goes all the way to, as you can see, eastern Texas. Okay. So a lot of students, guys, maybe have heard the two terms, sharecropping and also tenant farming, but maybe they don't really know or completely understand the process. Well, first of all, let's look at a couple of descriptions. Okay, so tenant farming would be, if you were to give somebody an option of being one of the two, they would probably have most likely chosen to be a tenant farmer. And the reason being is because, at least if you're a tenant farmer, you already have some money to actually be able to do what's called renting the land. Okay, so technically it's still someone else's land, but you're renting it. You can keep the profits after you've actually paid them their share, their amount of what they tell you running 100 acres is going to cost you $100 a year or whatever. Okay, so you have the money to say, okay, you know what? Here's your $100, and you know what? Whatever I have left over is going to be what I take in. Okay. Now, one downside of farming in general is, keep in mind, you're kind of at the mercy of weather and conditions, right? So you're not guaranteed that when you plant 100 or 200 or 300 acres, that land is going to yield that amount of crop. Okay. So that's one of the basic downsides of that system. Now, sharecropping. Think about those two parts of that term. Okay. So cropping is exactly the way it sounds. All right. So you're going to be planting a crop. It's going to be cotton. It's going to be tobacco. It's going to be soybeans, whatever. Okay. But the difference, guys, between a sharecropper and a tenant farmer is that a sharecropper does not have money to be able to rent the land. And so he or the family or she, whoever it is, they're going to basically sign a contract, and they're basically going to tell the landowner, whoever it is, doesn't matter, family, etc., that whatever amount that they actually produce or actually farm, that they're going to actually give the family a share, right? So that's going to be the payment. Okay. So if you farm 100 acres, and that's your contract, right? And by the way, guys, the contract we'll get to more in a second, but it's a legally binding document. Keep in mind, the thing that you have to really keep in mind is that that person is expecting 50 acres of production. Well, think about what I just said. If you're, let's say, a summer, like I've lived in North Carolina since 1993, and I remember at the time a friend of mine whose dad was a tobacco farmer. It was a really brutal summer in North Carolina, our part of North Carolina, especially little rain, very little rain. And I think he lost probably about a third of his crop. Okay. Now, he wasn't a sharecropper, but that's a problem, right? When you're trying to basically be able to sell to make any money or a profit. Okay. So with sharecropping, if you had a really bad season, you told your landlord that you were going to give him or her 50 acres, and let's say you only were able to produce 40, and let's say you kept a little bit for yourself, but yet you only gave your landlord 30 acres, what does that basically mean? It means that you're already in debt. Okay. And think about, guys, why that's going to be a problem. Okay. If you're in debt, that means that you owe someone something of value. And so many of these former slaves or freedmen, guys, that are sharecroppers and even tenant farmers, they are farming in many cases the exact same land of where they were as slaves prior to actually being freed. Okay. So what this system is going to do, it's going to basically tie them to the land. Okay. And so imagine long term, right? Okay. 1 year, I'm already $20,000 or whatever it may have been into debt. And that debt piles up, and those people, guys, are never able to basically get away from that land, right? And here's the one thing to also keep in mind, okay? Many of these people, guys, are not like Frederick Douglass, where they went on to become literate and great orators and things like that, okay? And so a lot of them were not familiar with the wording of these contracts, and they were taken advantage of, right? Not really a good thing to think about. And so imagine you're signing your signature on a contract. Somebody could deceive you, and basically it's a legally binding document, and you're going to be basically tied to that land. Okay. So not exactly a good situation, but it is important. This labor system is very much going to be linked to the Southern economy for quite a while post-Civil War. Okay. So just something to keep in the back of your mind. Okay. All right. So a little bit of industry, some city growth. But again, guys, post-Civil War, you're gonna continue to see industrialization, but the majority of the industrialization, I would say, is going to be more linked to the northern states. Okay. Now, one thing to keep in mind, you are going to see, like when, guys, in a few weeks, those of you that are studying the rise of what we call the second wave of industrial revolution, or even the rise of big business, as I like to call it, you're going to come across a bunch of household names like Carnegie, Rockefeller, even James B. Duke. And for those of you that are from the Tobacco South and North Carolina particularly, a lot of you guys are like, well, Duke. I think about the university, but I also think of tobacco. Well, guys, Duke was a pretty big name when it came to the idea of tobacco and mass production and things like that. So there is going to be some progress made, but I would argue it's going to be quite a bit more limited compared to the kind of things that you'll notice developing in northern states like New York, Ohio, places like that. Okay. All right. Socially, ask yourself, guys, the following question. Would it be a smooth and easy transition for these freedmen that many of them, the majority of them guys, have never probably been, or very rarely been, maybe 5 to 10 miles beyond where they're from, right? So they don't have social mobility as freedom. They don't have, of course, political freedom through voting rights. And of course, they also, in many cases, because of some of the limitations economically, they haven't really had economic freedom. Okay. And so the argument, guys, is that even, as valiant of the effort of the Freedmen's Bureau was to try to extend some opportunity and to try to transition them, I would say that to a large degree, it's going to be really a tough situation and one that yielded, limited success. Okay. If you take a look here, guys, you'll notice that there are going to be some things popping up that further limit, like, for example, especially Louisiana, Mississippi, places like that. So deep South, you notice what are called black codes. Okay. And what is a black code? Well, think about prior to the Civil War, when a lot of these states were noticing like a lot of, or at least a good number of slave uprisings, and they started to pass slave codes that limited reading and writing and things like that. Well, these black codes are going to be very similar. Okay. So if you ever read like the Mississippi Black Code, okay, the one thing, guys, that you'll notice is that, first of all, it's very legal language because they're laws, right? That's what these codes are. They're laws that are basically designed to further define, in the view of a lot of these southern states, the rights of the freedmen. Okay. Now, something that's interesting, guys, is, to a lot of us that read them, it's like, okay, these are not furthering their rights. In fact, it's limiting them, right? Creating things like poll taxes and, like not the right to own weapons and things like that. Okay. But the argument on the other side of the coin is that many of these southern states saw this as actually expanding them. So there's going to be a clear divide. Think about the radical Republicans, guys, with why they were so adamant about extending more equality. They're going to see a lot of these policies as taking a step back from the true purpose of Reconstruction. Okay. And so therefore, if you're wondering, well, why does Reconstruction last 12 years instead of just a few years? One of the reasons why is because many of these people saw that many of these southern states, Confederate states, past Confederate states, are not following through with the true purpose of furthering equality, especially. Okay. And then you throw into it even the development of organizations called the Ku Klux Klan. Okay. And this organization will develop over time. It was created, I believe it was in 1866 in Pulaski, Tennessee. There's different theories about the original intention, but at the end of the day, what it became very much known and associated with, guys, is not just intimidating, African Americans from voting and having a place in society, but even like a lot of your white Republicans, right, that were not associated with the Democratic Party, they would even try to limit their involvement. Okay. Now, I'm only going to say a few things about political, but keep in mind what we said last time, a Jim Crow law. These are formal laws that are legalizing segregation. Okay. So in other words, it is legal to have separate facilities according to these laws. Okay. Now, eventually, as we'll see here in a second, guys, real briefly, the U.S. Supreme Court is going to have to make a decision. Okay. about whether or not some of these policies are quote unquote constitutional or whether they are not. Okay. And in many cases, guys, what you're going to notice is that early on, up until really the 1950s, I would say, so, for about the next, about the next 70, 80, 90 years, the Supreme Court is going to be pretty supportive of this policy of segregation, right? So they're going to confirm in their thinking the constitutionality of many of these laws. Now, here's where this gets to be a little bit complex. Okay. So let's say, the South, hypothetically, but we know the reality was it was in a pretty bad state after the Civil War, a lot of destruction, people losing their farms, the homes. Okay. And you see a couple of key terms here, scalawag and carpetbagger. Okay. Now, think about what we've already said about political parties. Okay. So if you're a Republican, that's a Southerner, right? You've changed parties, or maybe, you've obviously aligned yourself there. Okay. You're still a Southerner, right? You're still from North Carolina, Virginia, Georgia, wherever. Okay. But a scalawag is a term that they would use to refer to one of these Southern Republicans, and it was not used in a positive light. Okay. So it was a criticism, right? They saw these people as almost like, some people would say selling out to, some of the changes that are happening, right? People wanted to maintain the tradition of before. These people obviously have a different vision of moving society along. And so, they're from the South, and it's like, hey, you're not really truly along those lines. So there was a lot of criticism. They were also targeted, as you saw, guys, a moment ago, by groups like the Ku Klux Klan and other hate groups. Some people would use the expression terrorist groups. Now, the question is, guys, what is a carpetbagger? Okay. Well, take a look at this political cartoon. Okay. So before I give you the description, which I'm going to, what stands out to you about this image? Okay. So who's probably the figure here that's going to come to mind first? Yeah, Lincoln, right? The top hat, the beard. But what stands out? The beady eyes, right? Which usually is not a very positive way to kind of present somebody, right? They're meddling. Okay. And guys, a carpetbagger was a Northerner. Okay. And you can see that this is a carpet bag and this is a carpet bag. And a carpet bag, guys, if you ever Google this, you can look at it more. But imagine a humongous bag that you would use like a suitcase. Okay. And a lot of these carpetbaggers are, either wealthy or they have some money. And they would pack up almost everything that they had, right? Clothing, etc. And they would come down to the South. Now think about it like this. Why would a carpetbagger do that, right? And to a lot of people, the reason was, let's say you're auctioning off somebody's farm because they can't pay the mortgage on it or something. Okay. So a carpetbagger would basically buy the farm, buy the land, buy the business or whatever for a very small price. And of course, that was seen as them taking advantage of the really war-torn conditions. Well, as you can imagine, this cartoonist, all right, his name is Thomas Nast, by the way. That's one of the more famous political cartoonists of this time period and even until the later 1800s. Okay. How is he presenting this? What is the point of view of Mr. Nast based off of how he's sketching the image of a carpetbagger? And the answer is that, these people in the background, we're going to assume that they could be Southerners, that they are not looking at these carpetbaggers in a positive light, right? In other words, translation, they're seeing the carpetbagger as somebody who's really doing some harm. Okay. I had one person put it like this. It's almost like some people, guys, saw the carpetbagger as kind of like a domestic foreigner, right? Somebody who's from the United States, but yet they obviously are not helping out the society and trying to move it forward. Okay. Now, a lot of students ask the question, they say, okay, Mr. Baker, you've already said in the previous lesson, and this lesson to start off with, that Reconstruction lasts until 1877. Okay. Why do we have an end of Reconstruction? All right. And, you can pause, guys, this slide. You can take a screenshot of it if you want to. Okay. But the answer is because, and there's a lot of different things, Democrats are regaining control of the southern states and also the positions and the representation in the Congress for their protective states. Okay. But for the most part, guys, Reconstruction is associated with things like corruption politically. Now, I don't know if any of you have ever heard of the Gilded Age, but that's a political time period that develops kind of around this time and then moves forward. There's a lot of things that happen under Grant that are scandalous, right? And so people, guys, are like, okay, let's get this Reconstruction over with so we can move on to something different. Okay. But one of the bigger reasons why, and we'll talk about this more in a second, guys, is that eventually the one thing that pretty much is going to be what leads to the end of Reconstruction is the eventual removal of all those troops that we talked about last time with the Military Reconstruction Act of 1867. Okay. Now, one thing to ask yourself, and we talked about this a little bit before, would you all consider Reconstruction to be a success or a failure, right? A couple of things for us to keep in the back of our minds. First of all, okay, are we simply talking about the 12 years of Reconstruction? Or on the other side of the coin, are we talking about the things that continued afterwards? Okay, meaning that Reconstruction is going to have long-lasting consequences and effects. Okay, so that might affect the way we look at it. The second thing that we want to ask ourselves, guys, is, what is going to be, the kind of like weighing the successes and the failures. I don't think anybody would disagree with the fact that, okay, it's a good thing to define citizenship for African Americans, especially. It's not a bad thing to extend voting rights. Okay, to provide more education, union being restored. Those are things that are, I would argue are good. Okay, but again, look at this failure side. Okay, there's a lot of limitations. Okay, guys, the mindset that precedes the Civil War is not going to be remedied just because the war is over and we've had a dozen years. I mean, imagine, guys, that's not even an entire generation of people that have had the opportunity to see change happen. Okay, and so things to keep in mind. Okay, so the one thing, guys, that we need to keep in mind is when we're looking at the end of Reconstruction, the big thing here is the election of 1876. Okay, so we're not going to spend a lot of time on this, but this election is really the election that signifies the end. It's a controversial ending. Okay, now these are probably two figures that most of you are not familiar with, but one of them does become president. Okay, so think about what we've already said. Okay, you've got a big debate between Republicans wanting to be in office and Democrats. This is not anything different. We see that in the modern day when elections pop up. But in this particular election, one thing to keep in the back or front of our minds, okay, it's a very similar outcome with the election of 1824 and the election of 1800. Okay, the differences, guys, in this election is that eventually, both sides are going to be kind of like at a standstill. The Electoral College does not actually determine the outcome successfully. And what happens is they decided to actually eventually throw the election to Rutherford B. Hayes. Okay. Ergo, Tilden, as you can see here, guys, does actually do reasonably well with the popular vote, but he doesn't get the necessary votes that he needs in the Electoral College. The Congress House says, okay, you know what? We're going to vote. They decided there was a compromise. They throw the election to him. Hayes says, you know what? Okay, cool. I'm president, but I got to do something to actually move us beyond Reconstruction. He agrees, or at least his faction agrees, okay, to actually remove all those troops that were present in the South. When that happens, Reconstruction basically comes to a conclusion. Okay. The downside of this, guys, is that we see the remnants of segregation and Jim Crow. Okay. And we're not going to say a lot about this today because of time. But guys, if you take a look, segregation, there's a lot of different effects. I mean, think about the effects education discrimination has, employment, okay, police brutality, things like that, okay. You can clearly see, guys, in the picture, even from the standpoint of, laundry services. There's an interesting, kind of fast forward the clock about 100 years during the Vietnam War. There's an interesting movie, if you've ever seen it, called We Were Soldiers. And a lot of you guys might be like, well, Mr. Baker, we're in the 1860s and 70s. Why bring up something that happened 100 years later? Well, the answer is there's a scene in the movie where there's a group of women that are army wives, actually. One of them is African American. The other ones are all Caucasian women. And they're talking about certain conditions on the base and so forth. And one of the women, who's a Caucasian woman, who did not grow up in the segregated South, actually says, well, we can't do our laundry. The machines are broken. It says whites only. And they, of course, were like, well, that's not exactly what they're talking about. And they had to explain that to her. Okay. Now, those are not pleasant things to think about, guys, but think about that's 100 years after the Civil War is over. Okay. So the point is, guys, is that a lot of these policies, whether you're talking about separation when it comes to schools that people are going to be in, laundry service, etc., okay, that's a really big deal. Okay. I don't think you necessarily need to write all of these down, guys, but Jim Crow laws, keep in mind, you're talking about segregation being legalized. Okay. Again, you can, I think, clearly identify social effects and also political and even economic. Okay. So intermarriage outlawed, that's obviously a pretty big deal. Okay. And then you'll notice here, guys, railroads and also streetcars. Okay. And last but not least, voter restrictions. Okay. So a lot of these states want to limit it again, right? Okay. And so they're going to create things like literacy tests. All right. We'll look at one of those in a couple of weeks. And guys, if you think about it, we have a 15th Amendment in 1870, right, that says that there should not be any restrictions to voting, or at least it extends it, I should say. Okay. Take a look at the effects, guys, in these two deep southern states. This is a dramatic difference, right? I mean, you're looking, guys, in the state of Louisiana, you're talking about 1/26th of the voters after all these policies are put in place, okay, that can actually vote. So it's kind of like a very big steep incline and then a steep decline. Alabama, what is that? About 1 to 33.3. Okay. And so I want you guys to really think about, with our conclusion on Reconstruction, okay, where is the progress, right? And I would argue that some is there, right? I'm not going to discount that. We have new constitutional amendments. We have some opportunity. But guys, at the end of the day, we have to understand one big thing, and that is there is still a lot of work to be done. And the other thing I want to pose to you, because we'll come back to this later in the quarter, is what happens when you've got leadership like that of Frederick Douglass that eventually is going to no longer be there because of his death in 1895? Who's going to pick up the leadership to address all these different areas of equality: social, political, economic, and also legal, to name a few. Okay. And that's something to keep in mind. All right. Hope you all had a good session. This is Mr. Baker. Hope you all had a good one. Feel free to email me at bakerd@franklineconomy.org. Put any comments that you have about the videos and the information there. As always, stay safe, and I will look forward to seeing you in our next session. All right. Thank you and take care. Bye-bye.